It's the end of the semester, and students are scrambling around trying to get last-minute feedback on their essays, while a lot of instructors are barricading themselves in their offices. ChatGPT can lift some of the burden from both groups by standing in for the teacher reader at the last minute and offering some constructive revision suggestions. Not only can it read an essay draft with a fresh eye, but it can also offer pretty much any kind of feedback you might need, or suggest some ideas you might not have even thought of. You don't necessarily have to be an expert in a particular field to get ChatGPT to act like an expert. All you have to do is have it role play. ChatGPT is great at role playing. Just tell it to act like the kind of expert you want, in this case, a college English teacher, and let it know you want to give it a paper to analyze. It is important to be explicit with the instructions in your prompt, though, and this includes giving it the prompt for the essay you want it to analyze. In other words, papers you write for school always have some kind of prompt, no matter how minimal. In college, it's likely that you've been given an entire assignment sheet with specific instructions for the topic, form, length, and other requirements for the assignment. This is important context ChatGPT can use to focus its feedback for you and to identify any potential problems with what you've written that could net you a low grade. I can't stress that enough. You could have the most beautifully written essay in the world, but if it doesn't serve the purpose of an assignment, it won't do well. This is an important lesson about writing and about the rhetorical context in particular. We always write something for a particular need or occasion in order to achieve a particular purpose with a particular audience. This is the rhetorical situation in which we communicate. A school assignment is the same. It outlines your purpose for writing, as well as your audience if the audience isn't implicit, that is, your teacher. You're being assessed partly on how well you're communicating within that rhetorical situation. In the first part of this prompt, I've explicitly told ChatGPT what role I want it to play and what important information it should wait for. This is important because otherwise it's liable to adopt its role and invent an essay to analyze before you get a chance to give it your own work. So here's the first part of the prompt. I want you to act like a college English teacher. I will provide you with an essay on this prompt. Then I put a colon and then the essay assignment prompt. The assignment prompt is the part of the essay assignment sheet where the instructor explicitly states what kind of essay should be written and on what topic, along with any important requirements like research. This is usually the first thing on the assignment sheet or very near the top of the assignment sheet. You may have to edit what your instructor has written in the assignment sheet just to trim the prompt down to essential information. But ChatGPT can actually take a long prompt, so if you need to, just copy in your instructor's entire prompt. Here, I'm using a prompt I gave my own students when we were reading Thomas More's Utopia. Edited a bit from my assignment sheet. I'm typing, in Utopia, Thomas More describes a number of ideals, things he seems to suggest a utopian or ideal society would aim for. In this essay, define an ideal community of some kind, such as the ideal home or family, the ideal neighborhood or the ideal school, the ideal business, the ideal nursing home, or the ideal team, and describe in detail its ideal characteristics and explain why you think those characteristics would be ideal. This was an early assignment when I wanted to get students thinking about how complicated ideals can be, especially when they come into conflict with other people's ideals. I also needed to nudge students to see that what Moore was calling ideal, he didn't necessarily mean for us to see as ideal. Many students were missing the intent of his work, even with the context he established in the opening. And as we can see in Moore's work and in many wonderful dystopias, since Moore wrote Utopia, ideal societies or ideal anythings are impossible and probably not desirable anyway. I really enjoyed seeing what students came up with for this assignment, but they did have trouble understanding how to focus and organize their essays, which were classic definition essays. The prompt says to define a verb that calls for writing that focuses on describing specific characteristics of something, in this case, an ideal community. Now, I want to give ChatGPT a little extra guidance on what kind of feedback I need. Here, you can ask for whatever feedback you most need on your work, but for this demonstration, I'm going to ask it for a basic analysis that focuses on what all instructors look for in any essay, no matter the topic. Again, I'm being very explicit in telling ChatGPT what to do. I want you to analyze the essay's structure, focus, development, and general writing skill, and identify 3 things the writer can do to improve the essay. Actually, I want to change analyze to evaluate, just to be clear that I want it to do more than analyze how it works. I want it to tell me how well it works. That's the difference between neutral observation and inference and judging. When grades are attached, there is always a judgment of some kind. So I want to know how ChatGPT will judge the essay. And that's it. I hit enter to give it the prompt and wait for ChatGPT to signal it understands and to ask me for the essay. I probably should have put the essay assignment prompt in quotation marks to set it apart from my instructions. ChatGPT still understood, but it's good form to use quotation marks for that purpose. So now it's told me that it understands and invites me to give it the essay. All I have to do is copy and paste the essay into the prompt. Now, there is a limit to how much text you can give it at one time, so if it tells you that you fed it too much, you may need to tell it that you're going to give it the essay in parts. I'm using an essay one of my students turned in, so for the student's privacy, I'm blurring the text. In its evaluation, ChatGPT gives me an overview of how effective the structure is, telling me the essay has a clear introduction, body paragraphs, and a conclusion. Note that I didn't ask it specifically to look for those elements, but it knows already that these are important parts to identify and evaluate in order to assess the essay's overall structure. It also looked for a thesis and how well the main points of the paragraph stick to it. And finally, it assessed how well those main points were supported with specific details or examples. These are all important things to evaluate in the draft of an essay. Then it gives me the 3 things I can focus on. Of course, grammar and sentence structure is always an issue. And notice it wasn't very specific about what I could do to improve the grammar. We'll fix that in a minute. Number 2 is great. Most student writers struggle to include enough evidence to support their arguments sufficiently. In this case, the evidence comes in the form of concrete examples that characterize the student's ideal society. ChatGPT has accurately recognized that this student's essay could use some more examples. It wouldn't hurt anyway. And here, it did point to a specific part of the essay that could benefit from more specificity. And I agree with what it's saying. If you're going to talk about government corruption, you really need to give some clear and compelling examples of that corruption. I also really like number 3, where ChatGPT suggests taking into account alternative views or counter-arguments. And it offered another example, saying the reader could reasonably argue that it's impossible to eliminate all corruption. And that's actually a crucial point because it's what I really wanted students to get at in their essays. I wanted them to wrestle with that discrepancy between our ideals and what's actually feasible or realistic, as well as between our ideals and other people's conflicting ideals. To produce a really thoughtful, meaningful piece of writing, you have to wrestle with those complexities and come to some kind of conclusion about them that can advance the difficult conversations of our world. What kind of communities should we be building? What do we really want our society to look like? Feel like? How does that feel for all the members of our society and not just for one group? Can we come up with a version of society in which we can all feel like we belong? Now, I want to make sure that ChatGPT isn't just pulling some standard feedback from its training and is actually seeing and assessing the contents of this essay, so I'm asking it to identify the thesis statement. This is also really helpful if you want to see if your thesis is stated clearly enough and at a part of the essay where the reader would expect to find it. It's a test. Again, for student privacy, I'm blurring out the actual thesis, but ChatGPT did recognize it. At least, this is the sentence I picked out as the student's thesis, so we're in agreement. Now, I want it to help me a bit more with the grammar and sentence structure. All I have to do is ask it for some examples of the grammar problems it saw. I like giving it a specific number, usually 3 to 5 examples, when I want some targeted feedback. That's a good number to help me know where the strengths and weaknesses are without overwhelming me or pointing me to a problem that isn't significant enough to really spend my energy on. It does a nice job here of pulling some specific sentences from the essay, which it puts in quotation marks and then suggesting ways of improving each of the sentences. For privacy, I'm blurring the student's sentences, but I'm showing you the substance of the feedback. It says exactly how the sentence can be corrected or just improved for clarity. This kind of feedback can give you a good idea of where you're still learning and might need a refresher or more practice. And making these corrections and looking through your essay for other sentences that might suffer from the same kinds of problems can give you that practice so that after a while you won't need ChatGPT to find the problems. You'll learn to spot and even avoid them on your own, and they won't be there any longer. ChatGPT is by no means foolproof. I fed it an essay that had some significant problems with repeated sentences and ideas, and even a second introductory paragraph, a few paragraphs into the body of the essay. These problems were the result of using AI to expand paragraphs and sections of the essay. The AI tended to give me an introduction with every expansion, so the overall essay didn't flow very well. When I asked ChatGPT to look specifically for repeated ideas, information, and statements, it found none. It congratulated me on the well-written essay. Any human reader, though, would have spotted the out-of-place repetition right away. But it can still offer some valuable feedback for strengthening your writing before you turn it in. And I have a feeling that in time, it will get better at detecting the problems it's not spotting now. Finally, I want to know what grade the essay might earn based on a set of grading standards. This is really important because I don't want everyone running to their teachers to argue that ChatGPT gave them a better grade than the teacher did. Grading is evaluating, and evaluating, like defining, requires some specific criteria or standards on which all the essays for a given assignment can be assessed. This is why instructors use rubrics, to ensure that the standards or criteria for evaluation that they're using are clearly stated and applied consistently from paper to paper. So it isn't fair to ask AI to grade your essay unless you can ask it for a grade based on the same standards or criteria that your instructor or school would use. In this case, I'm going to ask it to grade this essay based on some basic criteria for A-level, B-level, C-level, and D-level work. You can use these criteria if you just want to get a sense of where your essay would fall right now on a basic grading scale. But these criteria are really general, and chances are your instructor has made a rubric available to you that lists more specific criteria that you can feed to ChatGPT for assessment. Based on my basic criteria, ChatGPT has assessed the essay as B-level work, and that's actually the grade I gave the essay years ago when I assigned it. So that's comforting to know, especially since ChatGPT explains why it decided on this grade, and the reasons it gives are the same ones I gave for my own assessment. Good job, ChatGPT. Here's another example where I asked ChatGPT to grade what I knew was a much weaker student essay. This one, an argument on same-sex marriage. I just changed the prompt to ask it to grade an essay that makes an argument on same-sex marriage. ChatGPT gave the essay a D and explained why. I agree, and what this is really telling me about my own grading is that it's in line with standard assessments from a large, diverse batch of data that was used to train ChatGPT. In other words, I think this suggests my grading is pretty consistent with a lot of other college instructors, and that's what we want. Your teacher is always the best person to work with on your writing because your teacher knows exactly what you're working on and why you're working on it. But teachers have so many students that there just aren't enough hours in the day to work with each student as much as we'd like. So when you can't get expert human feedback on your writing, ask ChatGPT. Not only will you get some good feedback for improving your work before you turn it in, but you're also liable to pick up some new skills in the process. And teachers, this is a great way to give yourself a sanity check when you've been grading a few hundred essays and aren't sure anymore if you're reading anything clearly.